Australian Mathematical Society. And the Australian Mathematical Society is usually abbreviated AustMS for those who may not know it, and I will refer to the committee as the EDI committee. So the EDI committee, or Equity, Diversity and Inclusion Committee, was established by the Australian Mathematical Society in 2018, quite late in 2018. So we are a very young committee of the society with the remit that went well beyond that of gender equity, which is the area in which the society had so far focused its efforts for inclusion. I wanted to start with this brilliant picture, which was designed by Ainsley Pullen, one of many actually that she drew. She's a member of our committee. And it expresses mathematics for all. For the mathematicians in the audience, you will recognize that the framework of this picture is the for all symbol, the upside down A, and it includes all the various underrepresented groups that one might, that might come to your mind when we think about underrepresentation in mathematics. And that includes gender, of course, since women are still very underrepresented in the group of mathematicians we might see around the country. But it also includes people of LGBTQI+ orientation, their ethnicity, origin, language background, indigenous status, and disability status. So what else can I tell you about the background of this lecture? In particular, I'd like to draw your attention to the code of conduct that the EDI committee formulated and that the Council of the Australian Mathematical Society adopted a year ago. And it starts with values, which I think every well-meaning person in the mathematical community and the wider grouping would accept as human values. That's the values of respect, dignity, honesty, integrity. I won't read out everything here, but I'd like to point your attention to equitable and merit-based award and recognition, equality of opportunity regardless of age, race, nationality, gender identity, sexuality, religion, disability, ethnicity, marital status, political affiliation, or culture. The actions that we have undertaken so far, as I've just mentioned, includes the code of conduct. But the two events that have happened, one of which has happened already from yesterday, and one which is about to happen in this session, are the Dr. Mandawuy Yunupingu lecture, which will be an annual fixture, annual plenary lecture at each meeting of the Australian Mathematical Society, and the special session we had yesterday on equity, diversity, and inclusion. We've also worked hard on various other things in the background. One of the ones I'll mention here are proposed new rules, a consistency of rules, particularly taking into account career interruption for all AustMS prizes and awards. So without further ado, let me now talk about the focus of this lecture. It is named after Dr. Mandawuy Yunupingu, and this is a map of the area from which he comes. And what I'd like to do now is to read out some words that were prepared by Dr. Chris Matthews, an Indigenous member of our committee, the EDI committee. So please bear with me. Chris was hoping to be here to talk to you, but unfortunately, he's been pulled aside by a sad event, a funeral that he has to attend today, and he wasn't able to make it today. So these are the words he prepared. I would like to welcome you all to the first Dr. Mandawuy Yunupingu lecture. I would also like to acknowledge Yalmay Yunupingu, wife of Mandawuy Yunupingu, and Kathy McMahon, sister to Yalmay. We appreciate that you have taken the time to listen to the first Dr. Mandawuy Yunupingu lecture to honor his vision and extensive contribution to Aboriginal education and Australian history, Australian society. The AUSTMS has committed to recognizing and increasing the diversity of our members, and in doing so is committed to ensure that members are safe and can fully participate in AUSTMS activities and programs without discrimination. AUSTMS is committed to equality of opportunity. As a key initiative, the AUSTMS Equity and Diversity Committee proposed a lecture series on equity and diversity issues that will be a permanent part of the AUSTMS annual conference. The EDI committee were also committed to naming the lecture series after an Indigenous Australian who had a connection to mathematics and/or mathematics education. This naming recognizes and values the oldest living culture in the world, the Aboriginal people of Australia. It values their knowledge system, their deep connection to country, and their intellectual history. The Equity and Diversity Committee set a selection process whereby members of the committee could put forward a biography on a potential candidate, and the collection of candidates were discussed after presentation to the EDI committee. And after this process, we unanimously chose the name of Dr. Mandawuy Yunupingu AC to recognize and celebrate his life work as each time the event is held. So Dr. Mandawuy Yunupingu is well known for being the lead singer of Yothu Yindi, a rock band from the 1990s. But he was also a visionary educator for his people in Yirrkala, Arnhem Land, Northern Territory, of which I show a map on this slide. Dr. Yunupingu was born on 17th of September, 1956 at Yirrkala in Northeast Arnhem Land. He did all his schooling at Yirrkala and took up a teaching position at Yirrkala School when he left school. He studied education through the Bachelor College and gained a Bachelor of Arts in Education from Deakin University in 1987. He took up the role as co-principal of Yirrkala School in 1988. In 1990, he became one of the first Yolngu people to become principal of a Northern Territory school. During his time as a full-time educator, he was responsible for the development of a both ways mathematics curriculum, now known as Garma Maths. His achievements include being Australian of the Year in 1992, receiving an honorary doctorate from the Queensland Institute of Technology in April 1998, being posthumously invested with the Companion of the Order of Australia, AC, for eminent service to the performing arts as a musician and songwriter, to the advancement of education and social justice for Indigenous people, and as an advocate for cultural exchange and understanding. He received his, the AC was awarded posthumously in 2014. The origins of Garma Maths began with a draft research proposal in March 1986 by Mandawuy Yunupingu, Helen Watson, and Stephen Kemmis. Dr. Yunupingu was a research student enrolled at Deakin University at this time. The outline for the research is explained below. We plan to begin our research into the development of a Garma curriculum in the area of mathematics. In this research, we will be attempting to integrate the development of our theoretical understandings with practical curriculum development. We have chosen the area of mathematics curriculum because it is an area of practical importance for our children, but also because it is an important part of the high-level abstract knowledge of the Balanda world. The research into the development of the mathematics curriculum took place from 1986 until its initial implementation at Yirrkala School in 1989. Researchers working in collaboration with community elders included university staff and students from Deakin and Melbourne University, teacher education students from Bachelor College and their lecturers, and Yerkala School staff members and students. The Gama mathematics curriculum is an evolving, living curriculum. Gama Maths was envisioned by Dr. Yunupingu as a balanced mathematics curriculum, which would use expressions of recursivity and spatiality to bridge and connect the bicultural world that contemporary Yolngu students live in. In Gama Maths, students spend time exploring ways of representing and interpreting their own Yolngu systems of knowledge and exploring the ways in which Western maths is used to give order and value in contemporary Australian life. Gama Maths is an evolving Yolngu curriculum. It is committed to curriculum integration and the negotiation of curriculum across two knowledge traditions. From this work, Dr. Yunupingu saw a strong connection between Western mathematics and Yolngu systems of knowledge. He said that our mathematics, Yolngu mathematics, is Gurutu. Gurutu is a way of understanding that all elements in the world are connected and forms a system of relationships. In other words, Gurutu is a complex system that models the complexity of environmental systems, including its connection with all people. As an extension of Dr. Yunupingu's vision, he was also instrumental in developing the Yothu Yindi Foundation for both ways education, pushing up into the tertiary sector. This vision started as Yerkala Community School started to graduate schools from the secondary school. It was set up in 1990 with the aim of establishing a Bush University, Gama Cultural Studies Institute, in order to enhance the education of Yolngu people and to share Yolngu's knowledge systems with people outside of Arnhem Land. The first Gama Festival was held in 1999 with an academic forum which sought to forge links between the Gama Cultural Studies Institute and the Australian Vice-Chancellor's Committee. This peak body acknowledged Yolngu knowledge systems at the forum, but Dr. Yunupingu's vision for both ways integrated university courses for Yolngu and Balanda never came to fruition. Regardless, Dr. Yunupingu was a visionary educator who wanted to share the complex Yolngu knowledge systems and understood its explicit connection to Western mathematics. So he is an ideal person after whom to name this lecture series. So that ends the introduction to this lecture series. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and hope that the speaker, the plenary speaker, the very first Dr. Mandawuy Yunupingu speaker for the Australian Mathematical Society annual meeting can share her screen. And this is Professor Rowena Ball from the Australian National University in Canberra. Great. I noticed that in the chat, everybody is sharing, or many people are sharing, the land from which they are speaking or watching this lecture, and feel free to do that, please, in the chat boxes. So without further ado, let me invite Rowena. Thank you, Rowena.
Greetings from Ngunnawal and Ngambri country here in Canberra. Thanks, Nalini, for that fantastic introduction to Dr. Mandawuy Yunupingu and his Gama two-way curriculum. I think he's just a fantastic role model. I feel truly honoured and humbled to be giving this inaugural lecture. I'd like to thank too the committee for inviting me. And special thanks to Chris Matthews, Chair of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Mathematics Alliance. And I'm really sorry that he can't be with us today. What even is maths? So asks that fountain of all wisdom, Twitter. Well, as each person here knows, with absolute certainty, there is only one fundamental, infallible, universal variety of maths. And that is one's own maths, of course. But it's a fair question. What is maths really? After all my mathematical travels, I still haven't got the full answer. But I have learned something important about maths as a human activity. So I'm going to begin where I left off at the end of my talk at the 2019 OST-MS meeting at Monash. Doing maths and mathematical thinking are universal human imperatives across all societies and cultures, as natural and intrinsic to our humanity as doing art, and probably as ancient. And I'll take it from there. There seem to be endless discussions about and statistics gathered on underrepresented groups in maths, about girls and young women and Indigenous students disengaging from maths, and we treat them as the problem. And there have been all sorts of special and extension programs to sort out the problem, usually involving giving them extra maths as we know it. I think most of these assessments are all wrong way up. Maybe there is more than one way of doing maths. Maybe there is more than one way of earning and giving credit for mathematical innovation and advances. In May 2000, nearly 250,000 people walked across the Sydney Harbour Bridge in support of reconciliation and Aboriginal self-determination. I was one of them, walking with my 3 children. And I looked around me and saw that most of these people are just like me. I was born and grew up in regional New South Wales, but my mother came from Queensland and her mother was an Aboriginal woman from northwestern Queensland. I also have ancestral country in Ireland. Among people of my generation and earlier, whose grandparents were born before the assimilationist, apartheid and white Australia policies of the 20th century, this type of ancestry is not uncommon. So I have historical experience of British colonisation and land dispossession from both sides. And since I somehow managed to grow up and become a mathematician, mathematical colonisation and decolonisation is a bit of a theme of this talk. For the last 7 years, I've been involved in maths outreach with remote Indigenous schools and at STEM camps for Aboriginal school students. At these activities, I like to start by discussing with the kids some of my favourite maths people in history, not one of whom is a dead white male. Among them is Brahmagupta from Binmal, Rajasthan, India, about 1800 years ago. The kids are totally cool with the image of Brahmagupta playing a game of village cricket and getting out for a duck. So we talk about zero and how Brahmagupta was the first mathematician to define zero as a number. And this is actually what he wrote in Sanskrit. Zero is the number you get when you take a number from itself. And the kids all laugh and say, hey, that's obvious. So we talk about this, how this is what we call a conceptual breakthrough. And once this conceptual leap had been made and spread, mathematics and science could make progress that would have been impossible otherwise. Of course, it was not a single aha moment. Things are not discovered in isolation. Brahmagupta, as one person, is given the credit for what was actually a collective and historical development in Indian mathematics in the context of that society. But the real reason I love Brahmagupta is because he wrote up all his maths and astronomy in Sanskrit poetry, not as equations. And as we all know, great epic poetry tells stories. It turns out that you can buy Brahmagupta's collected works from Amazon.com, and they are in some libraries. And apparently in the first verse of his maths poetry, he defines what a mathematician is. Somebody who knows 20 operations: addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, square, square root, cube, cube root, 5 categories of fractions, rule of 3, rule of 5, rule of 7, rule of 9, rule of 11, and barter and exchange are the 20 operations. I think I'm sort of getting there. Another mathematical hero I introduced to the kids is Lucna of Cordoba in Spain, who died in the year 984. She was the chief mathematician and translator at the Islamic palace of Sultan Abd al-Rahman III. Here are the sapphires from the 2012 movie, famous Aboriginal singing group from the 1960s, who toured Vietnam during the American War. The actor here in the foreground plays Wurundjeri woman, Dr. Lois Peeler, an educator and now director of Warrawa Aboriginal Girls College. And the kids love it that I use the sapphires as a model for Lucna, because Lucna used to come out of the great palace into the streets to teach maths to the street kids using dance and song. And I love her because she understood over 1,000 years ago, before there were any public schools. So the street kids of Cordoba couldn't read or write. She understood how important it was for all kids to have a high quality maths education. Oh, look what I've done. I've just spent, 5 slides on Brahmagupta, but like only 1 on Lucna. It's always the case, isn't it? Women and their achievements are ignored and airbrushed out of history, and this is true of maths women too. It's only recently that mathematicians, even as important as Mary Somerville and like the Hidden Figures, have been exhumed from history. So I've added a little bit of history. I think Lubna was more influential than conventional maths history admits. And not only because she taught the children, which certainly is important. I've just said that Lubna, as well as being a mathematician, was a translator. How valuable is that? Maths translation. Here at the centre, we have Lubna translating all the maths manuscripts in the world. Sanskrit, Greek, Chinese, into Arabic. And others down the centuries, translated from Arabic to Latin, French, German, English, Russian, Pichajanjara. And we have experts here on complex networks in this audience. Where would maths be today without the mostly women translators? Without Émilie du Châtelet's translation and correction of Newton's works into French? Without Mary Somerville's translations and expositions of Laplace? But we've just seen that maths was much more than manuscripts. Maths was done and propagated by dance and song and poetry and stories. The idea of maths embodied only as written equations and algebra and numbers is relatively recent. So, not being a poet or dancer or singer myself, I'm going to tell you a story. It may or may not be a true story, but that does not matter, because stories are nothing if not metaphorical and allegorical. Returning to the original Twitter question, I have added another to it. My maths is applied dynamical systems and stability. So this story is broadly about the two major strands in its development. And I'm going to tell you about the why. It's a story about colonialism. Let's begin the story at that great generator, gatekeeper, and guardian of colonialism, Oxford University. And we'll pay a visit to the History of Science Museum, where you would be forgiven for taking away an impression that all the maths and science of the world was invented at Oxford. Well, I guess they would say that. Among the museum's star exhibits are local mathematician Charles Dodgson, also known as Lewis Carroll's, photographic equipment from 1860. A blackboard chalked with mathematics by Albert Einstein in 1931 during a visiting lecture. Florey's original penicillin culture. I wonder if the original COVID vaccine will be displayed there. And this beautiful brass and wooden octant from 1769. More about octants and their role in colonial maths later. So it's all good historical stuff. Outside the museum is this procession of stone heads, and we can see that they all represent white bearded men. We marvel at these relics of imperialist triumphalism, which to me are quite intimidating. but which have beguiled many of us into deeply held convictions about modern maths and science being largely the outcomes of an unbroken, male, white, Western tradition. So, that's enough of that. Let's move this story on. Onwards and upwards, further north to the post-industrial heartland of England, where on the banks of the River Beal, in a village on the edge of the Lancashire Pennines, is this old brick building, where two old ladies named Victoria and Alexandra dwell. They will never invite you in for a yarn or even a tea party, mad or not, because the building is the Ellen Road Cotton Mill engine house, and the two sisters are a giant twin compound steam engine built in 1892. The speed of the engines is controlled by a centrifugal flyball governor. This device was patented in 1789, and it has become the prototype example of a self-regulating feedback mechanism. So strand one in the development of dynamical systems and stability is control theory. Its operation is simple. As the engine speed increases, the inertia of the flyball swings the arms outwards, closing a valve which restricts the steam supply. If the engine lags due to additional loading on the factory floor, this loading would have been due to a woman or young girl worker attaching an additional machine via a belt drive. The flyballs are lowered and the valve opens, increasing the steam supply to compensate. So the perturbation or instability itself actuates the restoring force, and that's feedback control. But the motions of this thing famously would become unstable, completely thwarting control of the engine. And the problem of the stability of the flyball governor obsessed engineers and mathematicians for nearly 100 years, because a lot was at stake. Steam engines lacking self-control became hopelessly inefficient, monstrous contraptions requiring more than the labour they replaced to control them, and a risk to the wealth of industrialists that was fed by the cheap, skilled female labour in the mills, and the whole business of colonialism that provided the cotton, whale oil, and other raw materials. Pretty powerful motivation to solve the stability problem, which was solved in 1868 by J.C. Maxwell, who published the first linear stability analysis that I could find. But the centrifugal flyball governor also embodies a profound change in the personality of science that happened over the 18th and 19th century. For 500 years in white European society, the mechanical clock, with its complete lack of self-regulating feedback control, had been the dominant paradigm in scientific culture. The universe was created and ordered by God the clockmaker. Newton himself had no doubt that God had initiated the motions of the planets, or wound up his divine clock, and intervened every now and then with a heavenly finger to keep his creation perfectly adjusted and on track, or reset his clock. But as stability theory developed and was implemented in control theory and dynamical systems, this divine open loop control began to wane, and awareness dawned and spread of systems as self-consistent, dynamical entities that can internally regulate their own destiny. Control theory was operating to subvert the clockwork view of the universe. The technological advances in transport, power, and communications made possible by control and stability theory are themselves agents of change, vectors of liberty, liberalism, and literacy in societies, enabling more sophisticated ideas of feedback and stability in complex natural and socio-economic networks. Now, especially in the context of a pandemic, we all understand the fundamental interconnectedness of all things, to borrow a quote from Douglas Adams. And here we have a mathematician, Tom Lehrer, singing this maths of infectious disease spread. But back then and there, in those societies, back in the clockwork days, people could not. It is surely no coincidence that totalitarian regimes favour clockwork metaphors. And just to evoke this popular awareness and absorption of the imperialist legend, I'm taking you to Detroit in 1958, where the latest model Chrysler Imperial brought control theory to the masses. And here it is, in all its white wall tire, tail-finned, chromed, candy pink glory. I bet it was a death trap. But it was the first car to have cruise control, a big selling point when Detroit was so competitive. For the first time, ordinary women, it was marketed to women, directly experienced closed-loop feedback control in action, inducing stable dynamics. The slowdown error as the car climbs a hill. The gradual reduction of the error due to integral action in the controller. The small overshoot at the top. And at the center of the cruise control mechanism is this little mechanical flyball governor. I downloaded that from the 1958 Chrysler Imperial Workshop Manual. Today we're so comfortable with feedback control inducing stable dynamics that we barely notice how it permeates most aspects of our daily lives, invisibly and in various electronic black boxes. While we are on cars, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples were pioneering early adopters of motor vehicles because of the importance of being able to get around country, and developed considerable skill in keeping them going. There are many early to mid-20th century stories of Aboriginal people on reserves who had cars offering lifts to the white superintendents who didn't. If you were looking for a 1958 Chrysler Imperial, I wouldn't be at all surprised if you found one somewhere up in Walpiri country. But that clockwork universe, that one that required an entire colonial enterprise to overturn, never existed in Australia, except locally and imported for a brief colonial period. The peoples who have occupied this country continuously for 65,000 years and more know a thing or two about managing a complex landscape with high climate variability. And Indigenous maths is the maths of complex systems. Now, the centrifugal flyball governor also transformed astronomy, enabling fine control of telescope drives and vastly improved observations. So, yarning about bush mechanics brings us to focus on this earlier strand 2 that drove the development of dynamical systems and stability mathematics, celestial mechanics, and the question of whether the motions of the solar system are stable, namely the infamous three-body problem. Kepler's laws gave explicit solutions for the motion of a planet around the sun. Now add a third body. When the gravitational field of sun and planet is perturbed by a third body, a moon, say, do they fly apart, crash together, dance and gyrate unpredictably, or self-correct? Kepler didn't know. Newton had a pretty good go at it. But what was the motivation to solve the three-body problem? Well, in this little book, Newton published in 1702, called A New and Most Accurate Theory of the Moon's Motion, let's note first this cool definition of what we would call chaos today. The irregularity of the moon's motion is in a manner vain to depend on any calculation, though never so accurately made. Aha! There we have it. Longitude. Whereas could the moon's place be but truly calculated, the longitudes of places would be found everywhere at land with great facility, and might be nearly guessed at sea without the help of a telescope, which cannot there be used. This was the problem that motivated much of 18th and 19th century European mathematics. Computation of longitude at sea was carried out by the lunar distance method. But if the motions of the moon were erratic and could not be computed with sufficient accuracy, neither could longitude be known. And venture capitalists and governments were not going to continue financing voyages of colonial trade, robbery, invasion, exploitation, and slavery. And insurers such as Lloyd's of London were not going to insure them. Ignorance of longitude was death, ships dashed on rocks, or hopelessly off course until scurvy killed off most of the crew. From the 16th to the 18th centuries, the major sea powers of Europe offered huge rewards and prizes to anyone who discovered a means to accurately find longitude. Galileo tried hard for the Spanish and Dutch prizes, and the stakes were rising. Whereas once only Spain and Portugal had divided the whole world between themselves, with the blessing of the Pope and therefore God, now Holland, France and Britain were felling their forests and stepping up their shipbuilding and iron and weapons industries. There was war and violent competition. Accurate knowledge of longitude at sea could make a huge difference in speed and access to colonial loot. Governments committed enormous taxpayer and sovereign resources in the interests of rogue private entrepreneurs and the demand for private profits from voyages across the seas. Thus, there was ever greater privatisation of gains and socialisation of the overhead costs. The three-body problem quickly acquired a life of its own within mathematics and theoretical astronomy. And perturbation theory and series solutions were developed to a high art, some would say black art, and various special cases were solved. And meanwhile, the problem of longitude at sea was solved too by improved observations and data collection, with octants and later sextants, and calculations and inventions such as the ship's chronometer. But we should not forget that much of the sophisticated mathematics developed in the 19th century, up to and including Poincaré's invention of an entirely new mathematics to deal with the three-body problem and win the Swedish prize, was originally motivated by the grubby and greedy problems of the multinational, competitive, colonial enterprise. I could do a whole talk on subsequent early 20th century history of maths related to dynamical systems and stability theory, and the contributions of Emmy Noether, Mary Cartwright, and other great mathematicians. But I'm going to shift this story. One of the tools much used in the three-body problem, as well as almost everywhere else in applied and computational maths and engineering, is of course the Fourier transform. Who remembers having to write code for a Fourier transform in Fortran 77 in undergrad? Well, I did anyway. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples used mathematical or relational transforms too, and developed these methods to a high degree of expertise. I'm going to call them Songlines transforms. I believe that much Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander mathematical knowledge is alive and can still be studied by those who are prepared to question misleading and denigrating generalizations and demonstrably false statements in the old anthropological literature, which say more about white anthropologists' lack of mathematical knowledge and numeracy, but still help to embed racism in our society and institutions. I also believe that current findings that Aboriginal school students are somehow behind their white urban peers in maths and science are just latter-day manifestations of these attitudes and serve only to propagate the myth of Aboriginal inferiority, the false notion of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander mathematical inadequacy has been curiously persistent. I've even seen claims by white educators that the teaching of maths is destructive to Aboriginal culture. Last year, I was honoured to be invited to give a mini lecture on the songlines transform in Pierre Portal's special topics third year course on Fourier analysis. This is a map of some of the main traditional ceremonial and trade routes over the Australian mainland, which was prepared in 1939 by F.D. McCarthy of Sydney University. The routes overlay pretty well on the modern road system. So many of our highways, if they could talk, could tell stories that are thousands of years old as we drive along them at 100 kilometres an hour. Maybe they do whisper the stories, but we're going too fast to listen. But how did people find their way along these routes? An individual or group must travel from home country to a destination hundreds of kilometres away. No one in the group has ever travelled the route before. No portable representational one-to-one maps, the sort of maps we're familiar with, or sat-nav. This is the wayfinding problem. This is Yuwalai country. Here around Guddaga in northern New South Wales and southern Queensland. The Yuwalai people were and still are great travellers. And they used to travel to the Bunya Mountains and to Carnarvon Gorge, here near the modern towns of Springshaw. Both of these areas are now Indigenous run national parks. And I read this in an article published in 2014. And immediately I saw this for what it is, a mathematical transform. Now, elders who knew the route would transform its singular features, so the layout, elevations, scalings, and so on, by repeatable rules into a fixed pattern in the night sky using named stars. This was the songline. On winter evenings, the elders would teach the songline and the method for recovering its inverse, the original route, to the young travellers who would be making the journey in daylight during the coming summer. This is a reconstructed star songline coding a route to the Bunya Mountains. It doesn't look like the actual route, so it doesn't look like a representational map that we're familiar with. But it's not meant to. Firstly, because it's a coded transformation of the route. Secondly, because it was coded up in the winter stars for summer travel. Thirdly, because travel took place in daylight, so you couldn't see the stars anyway while you were travelling. And fourthly, because the songline transform is an approximation to the root, just as a truncated Fourier series is an approximation. You remove distracting noise in the songline, just as you remove high frequency components. Talking about the Fourier transform and the whole family of mathematical transforms, if we strip away the algebra, the geometric representations, the modern notation, a mathematical transform is fundamentally about useful relations. It's a relational transform. Fourier himself always insisted on the utility and practicality of his procedure. No matter how complex the data was locally and in the presence of violent discontinuities, which to Fourier were no detriment when he first formulated it in 1807, against the opposition of the great contemporary analysts Lagrange and Laplace and Poisson. Fourier analysis was always intended to operate on data. Now, observations of a root would have been accumulated for tens or hundreds of years. Root would have changed over the years. What was to be done with these observations? Well, after each trip, data was added to the songline-o-gram in the winter night sky. I think this example of the songlines transform, juxtaposed against the Fourier transform, shows that it's not any inherent superiority of a certain group of people. It's not a high priesthood that leads them to the development of sophisticated concepts. It is the practical needs of a group that leads to the development of abstract concepts. And this is true of all the scientific development in human history. Maths and science are universal human endeavours. The Yuilai elders got their ideas from others before them. Fourier got his ideas from others before him. And at some point in human history, those others were the same people. Maths is about seeing and codifying connections. As mathematicians, we could be in the vanguard of decolonisation because we have the skills of seeing connectivity, and the discipline stands to benefit and be broadened and enriched and perhaps transformed, as it were, acquiring new and exciting dimensions by inclusion of the maths of Indigenous cultures and by giving true credit to the disseminators and translators of maths. We have nothing to lose and everything to gain. This story I've been telling you, I hope, will not end with this lecture. I would like to foreshadow a decolonisation of mathematics mini-symposium or workshop at a future OSDEMES meeting. Finally, I've not said anything in particular about my own research. Well, this is a brand new project, Seaman, with my colleague Elaine Oren at University of Maryland and Texas A&M. This involves computational modelling of all the motions of human muscles. So with applications to sports physiology. Now, many in the audience will be saying, well, not another study of white men. What is this preference? Why? Why the preference for using white men in scientific studies? Well, it's because as good scientists, we always study the simple things first. Thank you, and I'll stop here with a picture from my maths outreach on Gutan and Kukaj country. Thank you, Nalini.
Thank you so much, Rowena. I'd like to invite everyone to put any questions or comments they have in the chat box or the Q&A box. And I know that we can't hear all of you, but if you could join me in applauding Rowena for a wonderful, beautiful talk that went through, oh my God, tens of thousands of years of history, as well as different mathematical ideas. I would be really grateful. And there are many people doing that in the chat box now. Thank you. But that's a wonderful, wonderful talk. Are there any particular questions? Let me just look at the chat box. And while I'm looking through it, I'd like to ask Rowena a question of my own. I was fascinated, Rowena, by the songline transform. I don't think I caught all the details of the layers you were talking about. So if the transform and the songlines gave directions that are based on winter stars, for example, for summer travel, and you couldn't see the stars during the day, which is when the travel occurred, how did the transformation work from that information to the actual direction of travel?
Yeah, that's right. That's correct. The route was coded up in the winter stars for summer travel months later, and the same stars were there, but by summer they're in a different position in the sky.
That's right.
Or maybe not even visible. And this, according to this article by Fuller, Trudgett, Norris and Anderson, so I know a couple of the people who wrote it, in Journal of Astronomical History and Heritage, this coded transform, this coded route, was taught to the people who were selected to make the journey, was taught during the winter by the elders. So it was taught to them, and as I said, the method for recovering the inverse, the actual route. And they made the journey months later with this in their heads.
Right.
During daylight hours, so they travelled during daylight hours. And we have no, at the moment we have no other information. So it's a topic of my active research, and I would love for others who are interested to team up. Yeah. So it's a whole research project on its own.
Wow.
Yeah.
That sounds fantastic.
Yeah, it's absolutely.
I'd love to join you.
Oh, that'd be terrific. Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating. And this the article goes on to say that this is not, they actually this is a sort of a recovered song line,
yes,
made by the writers of the article, but they go to some pains to say that it wasn't unique to the ULI people. So
right.
this method was widespread.
Yes, I understand. Thank you. We have a question in the Q&A box, which I'll read out to everyone, if I may. So Greg Oates asks, hi, Rowena. As whenever I see such ideas presented as beautifully as you did here, I wonder how we encourage such ideas and approaches to be more widely practiced. I know we have made progress through groups such as ATSEMA and OSTEM's equity policies, through explicit references in AITSL policies and teacher education, but welcome your thoughts on how we can widen this. That's a question mark.
Well, thanks for the question. I would certainly welcome the ideas of educators in the audience, because although I've been doing mathematics outreach to Indigenous students, I'm not a teacher, I'm not an educator. But what I see is that the white colonial curriculum is very deeply embedded in the school's maths curriculum. And that's going to be I can see that's going to be very hard to change, because it's propagated down the generations. And I think efforts have to be made to shift the curriculum away from the white colonial imperialist maths that apparently was invented at Oxford University. Because when I give my maths activities to Aboriginal school students, they respond with instant empathy, instant knowledge. They're communicative, they love it, and the maths activities I give them, I haven't got time to talk about them here, but in the maths activities I give them, they are learning fundamental mathematics skills without realising it. So I think it's about shifting the curriculums, and then first in primary and then through into high school, and then working through in parallel to university curriculums.
Thank you, Rowena. I've just put the details of the paper that Rowena referred to in the chat box for those people who didn't quite catch it. Are there any further comments or questions?
Yes. I can't actually see the questions in the chat box. I'd be happy.
No, so there was one question in the chat box from David Roberts asking whether somebody could note the authors or paper here in the chat, because it wasn't quite visible on his screen. But we had the other question that came through the Q&A box, and because I marked it, answered, it shifted to a different column. That was from Greg Oates.
All right. So I'll hang around sort of later on in if anyone thinks of anything. I'll hang around in the bar. I'll hang around in the bar later on.
The Gather Town Bar.
Yes.
Good. That sounds like a lovely idea. Thank you so much.
You can bail me up.
So I'll just read some of the adjectives that were in the chat box because they really reflect my own opinion of your talk, Rowena. Sophie Rayner said, wonderful, motivating, celebratory, and an important topic. Profound thanks. Leslie Ward said, thank you, Rowena, for your wonderful, enlightening talk. Ole Warner said, thanks, Rowena. I encourage everyone to travel to the Bunya Mountains, such a magical place.
Yeah, it's certainly that, yeah.
Jackie Ramage said, Rowena, that talk was a work of art. Thank you so much. And Greg Oates said, an inspiring talk, Rowena, wonderful. So I think we are all in the same place in response to your talk. And I want to thank you for giving us this talk. And I want to encourage everybody to consider the very important topics that Rowena has brought up today and work with us towards making mathematics for all. Thank you so much. This is the end of this session. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Nalini. Bye.